Thank you very much. And good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this Levelling Up Commission inquiry session looking at education skills and training. So if that's not the meeting you're here for, now is the time to go. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Paula Sherriff. I'm the former Shadow Minister for Social Care and Mental Health, also the former Shadow Minister for Women and Equalities. And my current role is working in inequalities management for NHS West Yorkshire. I'll be chairing today's proceedings, and thank you for coming along to today's session. I've just got some preamble that I'm going to go through, and then we'll get straight into the business of today's meeting. So as I said, today's meeting will be focusing on the place of education, skills and training within the Levelling Up agenda, looking at the issues of educational inequalities, but more importantly, some of the solutions and recommendations in this area. So much of our audience today come from local authorities, multi-academy trusts, schools, recruitment organisations, universities, and we're very keen to hear your perspectives on how you have approached these issues. As for the format for this afternoon, the session will be split into 3 sections. The first will focus on SEND and Pupil Premium, on which we have our expert panellists. So we have Jo Hutchinson and Nick Watkis. The second panel will focus on the uneven pathways and existing gaps that many disadvantaged students face when transitioning from higher education into employment, and accessibility issues that are not adequately addressed. And our panellists for this particular part of the afternoon will be Professor Lindsay McMillan and Dr. Holly Chandler. And our final panel this afternoon will look at the skills sector, discussing existing gaps and employment shortages of skills across sectors, and will highlight examples of best practice, both national and international, on how these issues can be addressed. And the panel for that particular section will be Emma Roberts and Kate Shoesmith. So in each session, our panelists will give a brief statement before we proceed to a question and answer session. And that will feature some pre-submitted questions from your registration forms and some from the chat. So if you have any questions or comments or points throughout, please do raise them and we will do our very best to get to them. And it's probably easiest to do that via the chat function. We will also put we'll put our email address in the chat. So if anybody wants to send any documents, links, points, or as anything additional that you would like us to consider, please don't hesitate to send those to us. So to our panelists, thank you for joining us this afternoon. I'd like to request that you keep your opening statements within the time frame discussed, as of course we do have such a lot to cover this afternoon. So we're now going to start the panel on SEND provision and Pupil Premium, and I'm going to hand over to our panellists. So we have Jo Hutchinson, the Director of SEND and Additional Needs at the Education Policy Institute, and Jo will be followed by Nick Watkis, who is a Senior Education Consultant. So over to you, Jo.
Good afternoon, everybody. So I'm going to do a very quick whistle-stop tour, taking into account what the latest picture looks like in terms of attainment outcomes for children in the SEND and Pupil Premium groups, and then how the funding gets allocated in each case, and where there are some issues with funding allocation that potentially could be improved, and also are differential according to where in the country different children are living. And then a very quick word just on where there might be some solutions to be found. So I'll get going because that's quite a lot to cover in the space. So starting with special educational needs and disabilities, the attainment gaps for children with SEND were closing up to 2015. However, if we look at the period from 2015 to 2019, the improvement slowed down for children with school support level SEND, and the gap actually widened slightly for children with education, health and care plans, so those with a higher level of SEND need. And indeed, since the pandemic, those gaps have worsened further, which may be in some ways linked to the exceptional awarding arrangements and assessment arrangements in 2020 and 2021 for GCSEs. So when we look at the SEND funding system, it's quite complicated, and there are 4 layers of decisions going on. Starting at the top, Treasury and the Department for Education set the total high needs national funding pot. So how much money is there to go around? Then dropping down to the local authority level, that high needs budget is allocated out to local authorities across the country. This is based on a formula, but one of the important factors in that formula is called historic spend. And it's basically how much each local area used to spend on special needs going back to before the time when the funding formulas were centrally allocated. So that's quite a few years back now, and quite a lot of things have changed since then, which is where some of the problems come in here. Then local authorities take their budget that they've been allocated and split it out between special schools, alternative provision, and also providing top-up funding for children with EHCPs who are in mainstream school, and sometimes children without EHCPs too. So there's quite a lot of complications and issues in that system. I'll give a very quick list of ones that I'm aware of here. The first one is that I've personally undertaken research into how children are identified with special educational needs. And the question of who gets an EHCP or who gets identified with SEND is quite a complicated one, but a lot depends on which school the child attends. And that's true for EHCPs, even though those are determined by the local authority and not by the school. So that's one issue. Schools also differ in their ability to meet their duty to provide the first £6,000 worth of funding for SEND needs. Depending on what their overall budget position looks like, that can be more or less difficult. There's also an issue where mental health needs are treated somewhat inconsistently in different places. And this is really a growing driver of SEND and also consequence of SEND in recent times, an important part of the picture that isn't sort of fully integrated, I would say, into the SEND system. There are also issues around NHS assessments for some need types having very long waiting lists. And that then affects the SEND system, which tends to just wait until there's an answer from the NHS assessment services. There's the big issue that geography of need has shifted. So which parts of the country are most disadvantaged? It's not a completely different picture from back in the days when we're looking back at historic spend and using that picture to inform current funding, but it has shifted a fair amount, and there are areas which have higher need now than they used to, and that's not fully taken into account. There's also some issues around alternative provision. It's only funded to age 16, unlike special schools, and it's funded on a bums on seats basis, which means something like the pandemic happens and all of a sudden their budgets have gone through the floor and they're having problems with keeping their teachers employed, etc. We also have a system that expects a certain proportion of needs to disappear at age 11, which I find slightly magical thinking, but nevertheless, that assumption is baked into the system and the SEND code of practice. And we do see large numbers of children who were recognised as having SEND in primary school, who then no longer are in secondary school. And of course, there's a shortage of special school places, and that particularly affects children at the highest severity end of needs, and that sort of top high needs end of the market is heavily dominated by private provision, which then makes it more difficult for government to actually ensure sufficient places are there. And of course, if you have a shortage, prices go up, which then puts pressure right the way through the funding pipeline. So I'll now jump onto Pupil Premium just to make sure we get a minute in on that. The Pupil Premium was introduced in 2011. Since then, attainment gaps have been gradually closing until 2016, similar to the sort of picture we saw with SEND. But by 2018, the progress on the national level gap closing had stalled and started to go into reverse. And indeed, since the pandemic, again, there's been some further widening of those gaps. The eligibility for Pupil Premium is linked to free school meals eligibility. So children who have ever been eligible for free school meals in the last 6 years are eligible for Pupil Premium. And the free school meals criterion currently is families having take-home pay of under £7,400. So that's before benefits, but after taxes. And that threshold has remained the same since 2018 when universal credit began to roll out. Obviously, that amount of money can buy a lot less than it did in 2018. And indeed, inflation has eroded both the standard of living at the threshold, but also it's eroded the government funding pot. So the total spend on Pupil Premium nationally was £2.5 billion in 2011. It's now up to £2.9 billion. So it has increased a little. But if you put £2.5 billion through the Bank of England's calculator to see what an equivalent amount in 2023 would be, it's actually £3.5 billion, not 2.9. So that's also been eroded over time. And some of the niggles in the FSM eligibility that I will mention. Firstly, it doesn't take into account the number of children in the household. So it's the same 7,400 if you have one child or 4 or 5 children. It doesn't take into account housing costs being different in different parts of the country. And it doesn't take into account anything like parental education that can be different and can influence children's school lives, but is not taken into account there. I will add one positive on Pupil Premium, which is that since the pandemic, children and families with no recourse to public funds have now become eligible for free school meals, and that's been confirmed as continuing on a permanent basis or until further notice at least. So there's a quick rundown there on the two systems, and I think where we want to look at in terms of solutions. In terms of the Pupil Premium, we've got a choice to make. Should we keep increasing school funding? Probably yes. But actually, could some of the needs be better met through a more generous welfare system? Yes, that's also likely to be the case. And where you improve welfare, you will see better outcomes in education, but also across other outcomes like health, employment in adulthood, etc., etc. On the SEND side, thinking about solutions, I tend to say we should start at both the top and the bottom here. We need to think about the places at the very high needs end of the system and how we're going to ensure that there are sufficient places by giving local authorities actually some cards to hold within the negotiations, because at the moment they don't, they just are price takers. And then at the bottom of the system, we need to look at mainstream schools, how inclusive they are and how well equipped they are to identify children's special educational needs. I'll stop there because I'm sure I've at least filled my time.
Thank you, Jo. That was excellent, and I do appreciate that time is short. So, like I say, you know, that there is an opportunity if you have anything else to send that through to us in a written submission. Okay, we're now going to move on to our second panelist for this session. Thank you, Nick Watkiss. Thank you very much, Nick.
Thanks very much, Paula, and thank you, Jo, as well. I think our topics have overlapped slightly, so apologies to anyone who's listening if I say anything that Jo has already said. So good afternoon, I'm Nick Watkiss. I'm an education consultant now, but I'm actually a music teacher by trade. I started in education on the front line in the classroom 20 years ago. And since then, I've been a head teacher, executive head teacher and CEO of various schools and groups of schools, and overseen schools and children on the front line in London, Kent, Hertfordshire and Midlands. I also Ofsted inspected for a number of years in the South East, was a youth advisor for the Mayor of London's office, So hopefully that shows I've got quite broad experience. But what shaped my career really is my passion for breaking down barriers for all children, but in particular for making the schooling experience and its impact more equal between the rich and poor, frankly. So I was asked to talk briefly about Pupil Premium today, focusing on solutions rather than the issues, and rather than identifying the problems. So I will try to do that for the panel, but I would be more than happy to receive notes or contact or about any level of detail I've spoken about today or anything else, actually. So particularly pertinent, I think is that gap between the disadvantaged and the affluent students is getting worse since the pandemic. And we must reverse that trend. For a time, the gap, as they call it, was narrowing for a very short time, but it's getting worse, and it seems to be getting worse and worse anecdotally and according to the evidence when we look at exam results or attendance and areas like that. So I thought I'd talk very briefly about how the Pupil Premium works. So many of you will be aware that it's a fund that is paid directly to primary and secondary schools to level things up for the disadvantaged. It's primarily gauged by those who are on free school meals, as Joe explained, and the whole purpose is to close the gap between their educational outcomes with their peers. That context is quite important. They are moving the national funds up to 2.9 billion of public money this year. It's a significant sum, even though not as much in real terms as Joe explained. But how that's broken down is just over £1,400 per primary child who has been on free school meals at any point in the last 6 years. And for every secondary school child, they get £1,035 if they've been on free school meals at any point over the last 6 years. Looked after children also receive funds, and as do children from service families, but that's not based on a disadvantaged status according to their economic background. And the fund is paid to schools at 3 or 4 points over the year, I believe. The schools decide how to best spend the money on the disadvantaged students. And I think it's important to note that these are not personal grants. They are not individual grants for individual children. They're aggregated grants that are paid to the schools for them to use how they see fit to benefit the disadvantaged children, but it can benefit others as well. There are 4 lines of accountability according to gov.uk. So the first is the schools must have a written plan in place, and that must be published on their website, and that must be updated every single year. Ofsted, the inspectors will periodically review the impact of Pupil Premium funding and the activities that the school has decided to spend them on, or the provision. The performance tables, of which all schools they published the difference between Pupil Premium and other students in terms of results and various other measures such as attendance. And governors of schools and trustees of Academy Trust are expected to challenge school leaders to ensure that the funding is and the use of it is positive. In practice, so how did the schools go about deciding what to spend their money on? I've had one school where it was £500,000 per year of public money. I've had another one where it was £250,000, so significant funds. In practice, the government recommends the schools use their Education Endowment Foundation research to plan to use the use of the fund. And it's outstanding research and guidance, if used effectively, can have an enormous impact. And they recommend that schools focus on 3 areas. So the first being high quality teaching, so what the kids get in the classroom every single day from their teachers. Targeted academic support, so tuition and other types of provision outside of the classroom. And the third is wider strategies, as they call them. The first 2 should be happening in schools anyway, so that's for another talk, I think, today. But I'd like to focus a little on the third one, so wider strategies, which are the most bespoke, and in my experience, over the last 10 years in many schools, I think it's the most underutilized. The Education Endowment Foundation says wider strategies relate to the most significant non-academic challenges to success in school, including attendance, behaviour, social and emotional support, which also may negatively impact on academic attainment. And in my experience, it's the schools that consider this third aspect in detail and ensure that adequate actual funds, real money, are available for bespoke support, get the best impact from the fund and impact best on young people. And I'm already running out of time, but I brainstormed a number of examples of some of the best practice from some of the wonderful schools I've seen over time. And so if you imagine those sums, you know, the £1,000 odd and the £1,500 odd in primary and secondary schools, times that by 6 years, what could potentially be done if you think widely enough or narrowly enough or cleverly enough about the young people that schools are serving. I've seen schools that ensure every single child that doesn't have an IT device is given a quality piece of kit, you know, narrowing the digital divide that I think one of the sessions, one of your other sessions was about. So a quality piece of kit, not, you know, a £50 laptop that's going to break after 5 minutes. I've seen schools give students that do not have internet access 5G routers, and they'll have that the whole time that they're at school with unlimited data that's faster than some of the schools can even provide themselves, once again narrowing that digital divide. I've seen boys mentoring programs through basketball. I've seen boys mentoring programs through knitting, in fact, and discussion groups around an activity working on hand, finger, eye coordination, dexterity. I won't tell you what it's called because it was very rude, the name of this club, but the second was Stitch. And I've seen provision of quality uniform items in order to raise the self-esteem of some girls in the school in Southeast London. And I'm not talking standard kit, I'm talking nice shoes, nice trainers, nice hairbands, the things that young people and probably all of us on this call would want to wear every single day. And that in turn made the children feel prouder, walk taller and come to school more often. Personal hygiene packs I've seen given to young men and young women at the right time, usually around year 9, our bodies change, and it's made a big difference and given massive confidence levels about being able to come into school. I've seen Kindles being given to wide groups of children with free purchasing power for books and periodicals to make them more interested in the subject matter around the school and just to make them more avid readers and get hooked on the type of the type of reading and text that interest them. I've seen proper help with travel, not just sending everyone on a bus that takes 2 hours, train fares paid for, group minibuses picking certain children up from certain places to make it easier to get to school. Some of our children who have family commitments have to take 3 or 4 people to primary school from the family. It is very difficult to get to school. And some schools are set up where it's easier not to come to school than it is to come late. So it's people considering how to break down those barriers really well. I've seen tuition such as music and support and sport, not just to raise self-esteem, but to develop elite performance in those who are capable of it. I've come across disadvantaged students who have become Olympians or great musicians. And the use of this fund, if used cleverly enough, can find that and plant seeds very easy and support and really break down those barriers. I've seen prizes and rewards that just make the people tick. If people know the young people enough, they will know exactly what to provide for them at the right time. Trips, including theatre, cinema, museums, sporting events, live events that so many people that would just not see unless they're incredibly advantaged. So some schools approach they see as bringing the world to the children, taking the children to the world by use of these funds in order to hook them into education and give them self-confidence. I've seen summer schools with a wide range of activities. I've seen cooking, I don't think it's called cookery anymore, cooking and practical home skills being taught one-to-one or in group sessions for self-esteem, but also to give practical skills for at home. And I even saw one school that created their own museum with displays all over the place which were similar to actual museums to enthuse their disadvantaged students and others on topics that wouldn't be part of the curriculum, but also to make it feel more familiar if and when they do go to museums of their own. It doesn't feel like an awkward situation because they're used to it. They're used to parading around their own school and in museum type learning. And then, of course, you know, therapies and support for mental health is huge at the moment as a requirement. I've seen schools use some of their pupil premium funds for those as well. So there's obviously not much time to talk any longer, but I would urge the Commission and anyone listening to consider how they challenge and support the increased impact of pupil premium by the scrutiny of this third area. And individualised approaches can work and are possible. I've seen them many times over. And I would end by saying the beauty of schools is that there is always at least one adult who knows exactly what would make a difference for every single child. Using this intelligence and freeing up some of the pupil premium funds for these purposes could change lives, in my opinion. We just need to encourage our school leaders to be bold and creative about how they use these funds and how they assess the impact of their work over a 6-year period instead of annually. And I do hope that it will make a difference. And thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Joe and Nick. And I got the impression you could both say so much more. So look forward to receiving perhaps some written submissions, and really inspired, Nick, by the interventions that you talked about in terms of the use of the pupil premium. We're now going to move on to some questions. So I've just got one question that I'd like to ask. First of all, it's a pre-submitted question, and then I'm going to ask our commissioners if they'd like to come in with any question for our experts. So whilst levelling up focuses on regional inequalities, and we know there are certainly high levels of health deprivation, particularly in the north of England, how can we better address the levels of educational inequalities created due to the postcode lottery system in boroughs and other localities? I wonder if either of you would briefly like to take that question before we move to our commissioners.
I'd be happy to, I suppose an aspect of it, the postcode lottery, I think is a fascinating one. Having inspected schools for a period of time, I think it's safe to say that there is less of a postcode lottery now, or statistically there is. I believe, is it 82%? It's around about 80% of schools now are good or outstanding, officially, according to Ofsted, with massive variability of examination results there. But in terms of the support the children get, or the potential that they could reach via the school, that is levelling out. But what I think beyond the Ofsted inspection regime, I suppose there's intelligence that can be gained by encouraging children, encouraging parents to give their views on how their school is performing for them, or how they could be improved for them and groups of people, and acting on that in some way. And I do think smaller groups to be, I suppose, use more data and more intelligence in terms of getting into those particular schools, because you can tell quite a long time in advance of a school officially going into decline, whether they're not doing so well. So movement of pupil numbers, attendance dropping, higher levels of exclusions, etc., etc. I think there are a number of things that the responsible bodies for the school can pick up on quite quickly.
Thanks, Nick. Joe, did you want to come in on that, or are you happy to move to the commissioners?
Yes, I'll just quickly say a couple of words. I think, thinking with my SEND hat on here in particular, I think it's something that we don't provide a tremendous amount of training on within initial teacher training and within the early career framework that's been introduced more recently, in terms of understanding individual types of SEND need. So understanding autism or understanding dyslexia, or, you know, there's a whole array of different need types that children can have, and actually the sort of recognition of problems, and then the sort of starting point for strategies for addressing those problems. And I don't have a polished answer for what the exact best policy will be on this, but I do think that we need to be injecting more specialist knowledge into the profession at strategic points in order to enable earlier recognition and more tailored strategies around SEND.
Fabulous. Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm now going to open the session up to our commissioners. I know we have Lara, Hilary, Neil and Anita. Would any of you like to ask a question from our two experts this afternoon? Neil? Yeah, go ahead.
Now I've got two questions, and Joe and Nick of course sort of indirectly approached these ones. The first is, there's bound to be a difference between schools with a large proportion of pupil premium and those with a smaller proportion of pupil premium, and the way in which pupil premium is managed and monitored. And I'm just wondering if that sort of shows up when you're thinking about the schools, because you can imagine a school with a huge proportion of pupil premium and the way in which that pupil premium is spent and managed, as opposed to a school with perhaps just 1, 2 or 3 children. Which brings me on to the next part of the question, which is actually about the size of schools themselves, because I've been concerned for a while about the number of primary schools, perhaps just 1 class and some relatively small classes. Have they got the capacity to provide the right kind of support for pupils with pupil premium?
Thanks, Neil. Joe and Nick, would either of you? Joe,
So I actually did a piece of research on this back in 2017, so some way back now, but I had a look at the patterns. This was in the era where gaps were still just about, closing for most prior years at that point. And you could actually see a difference between schools with high proportions of children eligible for free school meals, and typically their gaps were closing faster. And that does make sense, because a budget based on 3 children, you can only really choose individual strategies where you buy something for each child, whereas when it's half your cohort, you can hire additional staff that work across the whole school and work on specialist needs or general needs or just additional teachers or teaching assistants. So it's a different array of options for a larger school or a school with more children who are eligible for free school meals, that's for sure.
Thanks, Joe. Nick, did you want to come in?
Yes, I think that would be good. I agree with what Joe said. I've seen the use of pupil premium be incredibly effective and ineffective in both types of setting. But in the large school, of course, if you've got 500,000 plus pupil premium coming in, and a vast majority of your children are from a disadvantaged background, what you're doing to level up or add provision for them it's the same for everyone. So you can almost make it a culture and use the additional funds for what everyone receives. Whereas in the smaller schools, it is less money, but it's almost easier to identify those that may require the additional support. But then the other thing is, some of us are old enough to remember, people on free school dinners had to go to a separate line and they had to collect a little yellow token made of plastic. Everyone knew they were disadvantaged, or knew who had the NHS glasses, or knew who had no money, which is a terrible, terrible thing. I can tell you for a fact. So what the smaller schools will need to do is more of a covert operation with them when it works really well. Somehow they're tuning in with the families and the individuals to make sure that there is no shame or disgrace in, number 1, having the free school meal, or 2, needing the additional help, or 3, needing help to go on the ski trip or to the opera visit or to the ballet or whatever it may be in more affluent areas. So it's very, very important that our school leaders are supported to get it right, but challenged very ferociously to make sure the culture is right. Because once you feel poor or not able to access something, or that you don't belong as part of it, you never will. So that's really important that the schools begin that process, and culturally and mathematically and through their leadership planning and all of that stuff, get that really right and spot on from the very beginning.
Thanks, Nick. Do any of the other commissioners want to come in with a question?
Thanks, Joe and Nick, for your input there. Really helpful, really interesting. It just sort of Joe, you started talking about this a bit, but if you could wave a magic wand and you had 3 wishes for how you would improve the allocation of funding, either Pupil Premium or for SEND, if I'm going to take 1 wish out and assume that that's just more money, full stop, if you had 2 wishes left, what would you do to improve the allocation of funding through the Pupil Premium or SEND?
That's a great question. Thank you, Hilary. Joe and Nick, over to you.
So I think wish 2 would be on the Pupil Premium side. I would collect information about parental education because it's a huge moderator and isn't completely always aligned with socioeconomic disadvantage as measured through income. And wish 3, which is I'm going to use on SEND, I think we need to start over with the high needs budget, turn the whole thing on its head and start from a calculation of what kind of staffing model is needed for different levels of need and how much does it cost to create that staffing model, and then build upwards from there rather than starting with a notional sum that's kind of just based on how much we feel comfortable spending right now.
Thanks, Joe. And Nick, I'm conscious of time. We've only got a couple of minutes left for this session, I'm afraid. So you might
I'll be fast this time. I know I'm a talker, as you can tell. So number 1, I would ring fence the money that is going into schools so it can only be spent on that purpose. I would be more rigorous about schools getting intelligence on the families. As Joe just said, you know, the backgrounds of the families overall. So the plans are very rigorously put together and evidence-based. And I would audit more regularly the use of the Pupil Premium funds annually and over time.
Oh, fabulous. Thank you very much. Okay, I think that brings us to the end of this particular session. I'm sorry if anybody felt that they didn't have the opportunity to input there. Time was against us. Like I say, there is opportunities to send us anything in writing. I can see that Shivani has put the email address in the chat. And to the commissioners, there will be opportunities for further questions in our other 2 sessions this afternoon. So can I just now offer sincere thanks to both Joe and Nick for joining us this afternoon and for your excellent contributions. And you're welcome to stay, but we also recognise that you're probably very busy people, so if you have to go, that's fine as well.
Thank you for having us. Thank you.
It's my pleasure. Thank you.